They say that just before you die, your life flashes before your eyes. The life you have lived up until that point, filled with all your happiness and all your sorrows, all your good decisions and bad decisions. Your life from start to finish races through your mind in little more than a blink. There is very little, if any, actual proof that this happens. The real reason there is no proof is that to truly know, that means you'd have to die. I've spent most of my life alone struggling with depression. I've felt and watched as it slowly chews away at my psyche. Each new bout of sadness steals from me another little part of my soul, another little piece of myself lost into the ether. At my age of 33, I have seen so many of my so-called friends come and go. Family members lost and gone with nobody bothering to tell me until months later, when I found out from a random comment on some social media platform that I mustered up the courage to check that day. That was the way I found out that my mother had died nearly 2 months prior. I never got any notice or calls from either of my 2 siblings or any of my relatives. To their defense, I will say that they both apologized profusely, and each of them came to my little secluded country house to visit me. We all only lived within an hour from each other, and while they were over, we had all decided that we would spend a lot more time together. We agreed that we needed to strengthen our relationships and be there for each other much more than we had been in the past, now that both our parents are gone. Our father wasn't dead, but had left us shortly after my younger brother was born, and we hadn't heard a word from him since. I had gotten hopeful at the prospect of having my siblings become more of a part of my life and help me to develop a support system to relieve me of some of the overwhelming depression I faced so often. After that day, however, they never came back or even called. My little glimmer of hope that had been teased in front of me, the enticing shimmer of having help to pull me from my perpetual sadness, had been very quickly pulled from my sight. I lost my job shortly after, and my breaking point had finally been reached. My problem seemed completely insurmountable, and I felt like I truly had nothing left to give the world. I sat there with tears in my eyes, staring down the barrel of a shotgun while I sat on my living room couch. I was convinced that nobody would even find me because nobody cared. For that reason, I never even bothered to write any notes to whoever might come upon me. I stuck my bare toe in the trigger guard, and suddenly I felt like I was no longer in my body. I hadn't moved, but I also no longer felt like my physical self. Suddenly, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. I heard the click of the gun, then the explosion in the chamber. I watched as the pellets were suddenly uncased and rocketed through the barrel at me. I watched as my own blood and brain matter splattered across the walls, and I watched as little drips of blood began to run down. I could see as the particles of grey matter began to slide down the walls, resting softly on the floor. I watched as my body slowly slumped over on the couch, now lifeless and limp. I watched as the gun fell to the floor, slipping from my suddenly limp hands. The sensation of my physical body changing position and falling away from where my consciousness still sat was eerie at best. I sat for what felt like an eternity with my head turned, looking at my body laying sideways on the couch. Both mine and my physical body's legs occupied the same space, still sitting on the couch. But as I sat up, looking around, the torso of my physical body laid limp across the couch. I finally stood up and turned, looking in nothing less of a complete state of shock at the horrific display I had created. What felt like an endless epoch passed as I stood horrified at the terrible decision I had made. Only a few small chunks of brain tissue still slowly slid from the wall as the screen of my phone lit up as it sat on the coffee table in front of my body. It was a text from my sister. The small notification said that she was sorry for it being so long since we spent time together and that she loved me. She asked if I were busy and suggested we went out to get dinner together that night. Completely unable to interact with my phone, as a response I could do nothing but cry as I stared at the message. I regretted my actions so tremendously and now could only wish that I had waited just a few more minutes. I told myself that her gesture and her text would have completely changed my entire perspective and changed my mind. I was so angry at myself for being so impatient and so weak that I couldn't wait just a little bit longer. According to the screen on my phone, another hour passed before another text came through. Again, it was my sister letting me know that my brother had asked to join us for dinner and nearly begging me to respond to her so we could get plans finalized. I hated myself so much for not waiting and holding out a little longer at the sight of that message. Another half an hour had passed before a third message appeared on my phone. I never left where I was when I first stood up, feeling rooted and unable to move from that spot for hours. The third message just said that since I wasn't responding that they would try again another time. As the sun set that first night, the house got very dark since I was unable to interact with any of the switches, and I had no lights left on when I sat down to take my life. I stood in my living room in my dark and silent house, unable to do anything but wonder. I cried for hours at the sight of my own lifeless body lying on the couch and regretting my selfish decision with every fibre of my being. I tried making friends with the shadows, but with no lights on, there were no shadows to cast around the house. Slowly, another few days passed by. More texts came in on my phone, which was more activity than I had in months. All the messages were from my siblings asking if I had been okay and trying to set up various activities for the three of us to do together. I could do nothing but just let the messages sit, unread, as my body began to rot and decay only 3 feet away from my phone. I began to hear odd grumbles coming from the darkness that third night. It sounded like a deep, scratchy voice, but muffled, so I couldn't make out any of the words. At first I had been almost excited at the idea of someone to talk to, but that feeling quickly faded as soon as I noticed that it started to repeat. As if it were some sort of demonic incantation, the same few phrases began to repeat over and over. I called out to whatever may be listening or speaking, desperate for some chance, any glimmer of hope that whatever it was could take me back. Let me change my mind, anything. Without pause, the voice continued for hours. Other voices joined in until it was a choir of deep, heavy phrases. With every new voice added, the words became clearer, and at last I could tell that it was in some sort of ancient foreign language that I wouldn't even begin to be able to identify. That's when I saw it for the first time. The first one. Just a flicker out of the dark shadows of the corner. The shadows of the night finally appeared because of the darkness and full moon that night. It was small, only about as tall as my knee, muscular but extremely thin and sinuous. Horns and spikes adorned its head and shoulders. Its long arms and short legs caused the creature's knuckles to drag along the ground as it ran between the shadows. Its skin was as black as midnight, with hints of blood red at its joints. The creature's mouth was oversized, taking up nearly half of its smaller-sized head. It had long pointed ears, and I had no other way to describe it other than it looked like some sort of imp or demon. As soon as it reached the darkness of the next shadow, it melded with the darkness of the corner and was gone. I began noticing them more and more as I walked around the house aimlessly. The satanic incantations got louder and louder, and the imps began to show themselves more and more. Becoming less cautious and lingering amongst the moonlight for longer and longer each time. They seemed to be following me from room to room, and fear began to rise in my mind, curious about what they may want with me. The question of if they could even do anything to me in this out-of-body state that I was in. Just as that question flashed in my mind, a deep bellowing laugh boomed throughout the house, reverberating off the walls. The sinister chuckle sounded like it had come from some being with unfathomable size. For the rest of the night I stood by a window, just hoping that the light of the moon would keep various demons from getting to me. I listened to the chanting all that night as the volume rose and fell. Just before the first light of day peeked over the horizon, I heard the deep, massive voice for the second time.
Your fear smells delicious.
As I watched the light begin to brighten the sky, I saw a vehicle pull into the driveway. It was my sister. She had come to check on me since I hadn't responded to her or my brother, and my phone had finally run out of all power 2 days before. She was about to walk into my house and see my body rotted and decayed, slumped over on the couch. She would see the gun lying on the floor having slipped from my hands, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop her. I screamed and pleaded for her to stay out as I tried to hold the front door closed. No matter how hard I cried or loud I yelled, no sound echoed through the air. Her knocks grew louder and louder until she decided to just turn the handle and open the door. The door just phased through me as it opened, as if I took no more space than the air around me.
Oh, Jesus. What the hell is that smell? It smells like...
She said as she opened the door. I knew that if she had finished her sentence, that she had realised that the smell was rot. More specifically, the smell of rotting flesh. My rotting flesh. I watched as she called out to me while rushing through my house. All I could do was follow her around, dreading the moment she moved into the living room. I felt nothing but pure shame for what I had done. It was every bit as horrible as I expected when she walked in. She turned the corner, covering her nose with her hands. I watched as her hands fell to her chest and a scream erupted from her throat. She burst into tears and called my brother before calling the police. She screamed and cried from the doorway, refusing to enter the room where my rotted corpse lay on the couch. Her conversation with my brother was very ineffective for the sobs and anguish, but she was able to get enough words to tell him to come to my house. Before she dialed the police, her knees gave way and she crumbled to the floor. My sister never stopped crying, even after my brother had shown up and walked into my house. He also began to cry, and my siblings held each other crying on the front steps until the police showed up. I hadn't realised how much of an effect my choice would have on the other people in my life, and the sight of them so devastated by me being gone only caused me to regret what I had done so much more. The police did their best to take statements from my siblings as they attempted to speak through tears and sobs. All I could do was stand and watch as the coroner picked my lifeless body off the couch and shoved me into a bag to take me outside to the van. Everyone finally left just before the sun started going down that day. I stood in the living room, standing in silence and looking out over the blood stains covering the walls. I could see the dark brown stains on the couch where was once the shiny warm crimson pools of blood where my body had been lying. My chest hurt worse than I could ever imagine since my physical body was now gone, but still I could feel everything. It seemed even worse than when I had been in my body. Sinister laughs and grumbles began to emit from the darkness just as the sun dipped below the horizon. I had no idea what they could even do to me, but I could feel that they were after me for some reason. With each minute that passed, the imps got braver, leaving the shadows to taunt me for longer each time. The deep booming voice erupted from time to time, speaking simple sentences, threats and cryptic riddles that I swore were just to make me feel uncomfortable. I had no idea just how malicious the voice was.
Soon it will be time. You are nearly ripe.
The voice broke the eerie silence, causing me to jump out of fear. Who's there? What do you want from me? I called out into the darkness at the strange and sinister voice. Nothing but complete and utter silence responded to my question. Standing completely alone and surrounded by darkness with nothing but my own thoughts and regret to keep me company. The smell of leftover rot from my corpse was vile, and I wish I could say I would be able to get used to it. But I never would. It lingered in the air as a constant painful reminder of my selfish decision of giving up on life. A few of the imps that lurked among the shadows scattered around the room, laughing and whispering to each other, far too quietly for me to be able to understand what they were saying. Suddenly a searing pain came from my leg, and I looked down to see slashes in my ghostly form. An imp had just run past and drug its claws along my leg, tearing into me. There were so many questions that flew through my mind. The pain itself was immense and crippling, which led me to my biggest question. How could I, in this out-of-body-like state, feel any physical pain? In all honesty, it really didn't matter how. The fact was that I could, and it was very real and very vivid. A chorus of high-pitched laughter erupted from the darkened shadows of the room as I doubled over in pain. The cut was deep, but no blood poured from my wound. I screamed out in pain on my knees as another imp ran by and slashed across my chest, tearing another 3 very deep cuts. I could feel as the claws bounced and drug along the bones beneath my skin. The pain was so immense, but I couldn't even pass out due to being nothing more than a ghost at that point. Forced to say, tormented and tortured by these little demons. I lied on the floor writhing in pain that never seemed to subside for the rest of the night. All while these little creatures howled and laughed at me from the dark corners of the room. Just before the sun broke the horizon, in that perfect darkness before the dawn moment, the booming voice spoke one simple sentence. One that both confirmed my own thoughts and terrified me at what the meaning behind it was.
Your choices bring only pain.
Again, I cried out into the darkness, asking who was there and whose voice kept haunting me. No response came, and only left me wondering if it meant that my suicide only brought pain to my loved ones, or that it meant I would have nothing but endless pain. The cuts and gashes I had already sustained didn't seem like any of the pain was subsiding, even in the least. As the sun rose over the horizon and into a dull blue sky, I forced myself to rise to my feet and began to walk towards the door. I had no desire to stay in that forsaken house anymore, and I thought it might get me away from the imps and whatever else it was that I decided to hold up in what was now essentially just an abandoned house. I reached the door and gripped the handle, but no matter how hard I turned my hand, the doorknob wouldn't budge. Then it hit me. A realization, a memory that explained why I couldn't turn the knob. In my panic and frustration, my burning desire to get away from these painful demons and horrible thoughts brought on by this house, I had forgotten that I no longer had the ability to interact with the world around me. I could only move within it. I couldn't flip on light switches, turn door handles, move objects, nothing. I was essentially trapped in my own mind and left with nothing, except the desire and regret left behind by my poor choice. As I stood there at my door, letting the realization of being trapped in my house sink in, I was struck in the back of my other leg, causing me to come crashing to the ground. When I hit the ground, laughter from the imps erupted from behind furniture in the corners of the room that I couldn't see. Sinister taunting phrases were barked at me by the creatures hidden amongst whatever shadows they could find in the daylight beaming through windows. All I could do was sit in pain, staring at the blood stains on the wall as the day went on, wishing that I had been able to grow numb to the pain, or at least to the smell of the rot, but it never happened. Fear once again rose in my throat as the sun began to set at the end of the day, and the shadows in the house grew bigger. I noticed that the imps would grow louder and more daring as the darkness flooded my house again. I did my best to stay inside whatever light remained, but eventually my country house was bathed in pure darkness. A cloud-covered sky that night didn't even allow the moon to shine in through the windows. I sat in the pitch black of night in pain and fearing for a life that I had technically already given up. I had no idea that even after death I was still able to feel this much pain and suffering, but it was very much real. Just as the question of how it could be flashed in my mind, the grumbles from the small demons fell silent, and the deep booming voice of the entity I hadn't yet seen filled the air.
The pain you have chosen will be eternal. You will forever know only pain, amplified by the pain and suffering you have caused to those around you.
Who are you? What do you want from me? I cried out to the voice, doing my best to hold back the sadness in my voice. The voice only replied with a billowing, sinister laugh, with the added chorus of the small demons laughing along with. I suddenly felt claws touching my leg as I lied crying on the floor of my house. I kicked at the claws in the darkness and yelled out to whatever was touching me, "Get back! Don't touch me!" My cries were met with a growl just before I was attacked by numerous of the imps. Their claws pierced my body and they bit and scratched at my thigh until they tore and ripped my leg clear off my body. The rip of flesh was excruciating and the imps howled as they left me lying there and ran off with my leg into the corner of the house. I was in so much terrifying pain that I wish I could pass out, but I was unable to due to my current state. After a few hours of nothing but seething pain and listening to the grumbles and laughter of the imps as they chewed on my leg, I tried to stand on my one remaining leg. The second I pulled myself up, one of the demons slashed the back of my ankle, bringing me back down to the floor. As I hit the ground again, the rest of the creatures rushed me, cutting and biting at my body before ripping an arm from me. I could do nothing but twitch on the ground as if being in the middle of a grand mal seizure from the pure agony. No blood poured from my wounds, only pain. The deep demonic voice boomed laughter throughout the night and only faded as the sun rose and the light began to pour in from the windows. All I could do was lay, still delirious from the pain. For how long I lay there I wasn't sure, but I heard the front door open and my sister walked in, followed by my brother. After a few steps inside the house, they both broke into tears and held each other for a very long time, crying before my brother spoke.
I know it's hard, but we need to start going through his stuff and try to get some of these things sorted out.
It smells like death in here. I'm not sure I'll be able to concentrate with all the memories flooding my mind.
My sister replied to him through tears and broken words.
The police took the body, but left a mess. need to clean up first to get rid of the smell.
My brother said.
Wait, so you mean to tell me that there's still blood and brains all over the walls and couch in the living room?
My sister asked him.
Sadly, yes. I'll do my best to go clean that up if you want to stay out of that room. I think we should just move the couch out back and toss it on the burn pile. Less to clean. However, I will need your help to move it.
My sister nodded in agreement to help him move the couch, but broke into tears again as she stepped into the living room of my house. Seeing them both crying and hurting so much filled my heart even more with regret and shame. Still in so much pain, I could do nothing but lie there in the corner and watch my family move the couch outside. They took a lot of breaks getting the couch out to stop and cry because my sister could barely handle the loss of me. "I'm sorry, I take it all back," I yelled and repeated as loud as I could, but my words never translated into any audible noise that they could hear. Slowly a figure materialized standing next to me as I laid on the ground. It was the source of the booming voice I had kept hearing. It was wearing a tattered cloak that was a black so dark it seemed to absorb everything around it, as if it was made from a cloth from a black hole. Humanoid in shape and stance, there were long bony spikes piercing the back of the cloak, coming from the creature's shoulders and down its back. Its oversized hood kept the creature's face veiled in darkness, except for its long snout that protruded from the edges of the hood. The decrepit-looking mouth was filled with jagged and sharp teeth that looked randomly placed into the creature's jaws. A brown and bony hand extended past the edges of the cloak's long and flowing sleeves. Each bony digit ended in a yellow, jagged and long talon that I would only imagine a large bird of prey having. Clutched in the creature's hands was a long and gnarled black staff made from some archaic wood from a tree that I was sure had most likely been extinct for eons. The beast stood watching silently next to me as I lay on the ground, missing two of my limbs and writhing in pain. My brother and sister, having finished moving the couch, gathered a bucket of bleach and other cleaning supplies and began to try to clean the bloodstains off the walls as best they could. I knew that the stains themselves would probably never go away, so I assumed that they were cleaning through tear-filled eyes to at least eliminate the smell of rot and decay that had infested my house. My siblings were only able to clean for a short while before my sister broke down and started both crying and yelling.
I can't take this anymore. Why did he do this? Why did he leave us like this? I had to get out of here.
My sister said as she picked up the bucket of bleach and sent it crashing against the wall, splashing its contents everywhere.
I wish I knew. I miss him too. Let's try to come back a different day.
My brother responded as he helped my sister, who collapsed in tears in the doorway, up and outside to their cars. Regret churned in my stomach and my heart ached at the sight of my family crying so hard over me. Thoughts began to flood my mind of how I would never be able to see my siblings' kids again and how I had selfishly taken their uncle from them. My train of thought was quickly derailed as the creature turned to face me. A thin forked tongue poked through its jagged teeth and his mouth opened slightly. He began to speak and I noticed that his words escaped his throat but his mouth never opened. The hood kept most of his face in darkness and I found myself morbidly curious and hoping to be able to see his eyes, although that chance never revealed itself.
Now you see the pain you burden others with.
His words hit me hard because I finally knew what he meant. No sooner than the words escaped his throat did he slowly lean down to where I was lying. The hands not grasping the staff slowly reached out to me, and I watched as the talons on his fingers pressed into my stomach, tearing the flesh and wrapping around my intestines. The creature pulled my organs out and spread them across the floor near me as I screamed in pain.
Feast, little ones.
His last words before he faded into nothing. I didn't know what was worse, the intense pain I felt all over my body or the sight of all the imps chuckling to themselves as they crept towards me. They quickly descended upon me and began eating my intestines and fighting over who would get the next bite. I did my best to try and use my one arm and one leg to fend them off. However, it only seemed to anger them, and they soon grabbed my remaining limbs and tore them violently from my torso. It was worse than any pain I could ever imagine, but no way to escape it, no way to pass out or fall unconscious because how intense it was. There was no sedatives, no relief, just pure unbridled pain, and I could do nothing about it. I was reduced to nothing but a screaming and crying torso. I laid there crying and in more pain than any human should ever be in, while the small demonic creatures feasted on my limbs and organs, awake and alert for every excruciating second as I watched them devour me alive. Once they finished consuming my limbs and organs, the creatures began to close in on me again. All I could do was scream as they began slashing and biting at what was left of me. As more of me was being bitten and ripped away, the large cloaked demon formed over me. Between the slashes, I watched as the spindly talon-adorned hand reached down and wrapped its cold fingers around my neck. The huge creature lifted my battered torso up by the throat effortlessly until our faces were within inches of each other. The creature's mouth opened wide as if it was about to take a bite out of my face, and its long and forked tongue brushed up against my cheek, and he spoke again without moving his mouth.
You will know only pain.
His words echoed off the walls as they sounded. His mouth widened even further, and I wished I could close my eyes to avoid watching as I was eaten, but my eyelids had been torn and bitten off along with the other scratches and bites all over my face. The demon pulled me in close, and I could feel his long and jagged teeth begin to sink into me as he bit down over my head. I screamed out, truly confused that I could even experience any more pain than I was already in. Suddenly, as I was screaming, everything in my surroundings shifted and faded away, and everything went black for a split second. My eyelids were back, and as I opened my eyes with tears running down my face, I was looking down the barrel of a shotgun while sitting on my couch. Somehow I was back to the moment just before I pulled the trigger. Fear flooded my body at the thought of having to go through all of that again, and I pushed the gun away, letting it fall to the ground. It took everything in me to finally catch my breath and calm my heart. I still had no real answers for what just happened to me, but I did know that I wanted no part of whatever it was. I glanced down and noticed my phone sitting on the edge of the coffee table. Quickly I reached out to grab it and call my brother or my sister, but just as I picked it up off the table, it chimed in my hand and the screen lit up. It was my sister. But instead of responding or even reading the message, I pressed a button to call her.
Hey, Chris? How are you? Mike and I have been missing you. Do you want to get dinner tonight with us? We could do like a siblings outing. What do you think?
She said, answering the phone. It took me a moment before I could even gather the courage to tell her what was screaming inside my skull for so long. I eventually burst into tears on the phone before I finally spoke. I love you so much, Amber. Both you and Mike, but... I paused to deal with another flood of tears before I could continue. I've been so sad and so depressed lately, and I'm not doing very well. I need help.
Okay. Well, just sit tight. I'll head over right now. You, me, and Mike can all go out to dinner together later tonight.
Sure enough, Amber pulled into my driveway, and to my surprise, Mike pulled in behind her very shortly after. She must have called him on her drive, and they both decided to come. I opened the door just as they reached the front porch, and they both greeted me with big, warm and loving hugs. We all got dinner that night, and it's been a weekly tradition ever since. I see their families and their kids a lot more often now, and have put in effort to remain part of their lives. I see a counsellor regularly now, and I'm doing a lot better and feeling a lot happier lately. They say that just before you die, your entire life flashes before your eyes. But they're wrong. So very wrong. There is no sugar-coated, frosted-lined memory montage of all the times your grandmother kissed you, or every moment you got embarrassed in class by a teacher. What you see in that split second just before you die is the torture and pain that goes on once you are dead. The hurt you cause others with your absence, and the sadness they feel when they miss you when you are gone. That is the life that flashes.